The second volume of ICD-9, which if you actually look at the ICD-9 manual, comes first, is the alphabetic index of conditions. And then volume 3 is really for more facility coding, and it includes procedure codes. Physician coders typically won't use volume 3, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about that volume today. But when you're choosing a diagnosis code, you want to make sure you're always using volume 1 and volume 2 before you select a diagnosis code to put on your claim. Start with volume 2, which is the index, which, as I mentioned, it's a little bit confusing because volume 2 actually comes at the beginning of the ICD-9 manual. But that's where you're going to start. You're going to start in the index, and you're going to look up the condition or illness that you actually found in the documentation. When you look at that up in the index and you find whatever the condition or illness is, you'll see an ICD-9 code listed there. But you can't stop there. You need to then flip to the volume 1 section, which is the tabular section, which is, again, the second section, and find the code that you just were able to find listed in the index. The reason you need to do this is because you'll often find notes about that particular code that will help you determine if you're actually choosing the appropriate code or if you need to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that you're using a valid code. In some cases, you may actually need a fourth or a fifth digit that isn't listed in the index. The index may only list a 3-digit code, but in order to actually have a proper diagnosis code, you need a fourth or a fifth digit. So you'll see notes within the tabular section of volume 1 section of ICD-9 that will tell you when you need a fourth and fifth digit. You also may not be able to report a particular code as a primary diagnosis without another code associated with it. So you need to look for things, little notes like that, which is why you never want to code just by looking in the index. You'll really miss important coding instructions and details and could be filing a claim with an inappropriate diagnosis or an invalid diagnosis, which would just get your claim denied. One thing to note in the ICD-9 manual is that you have a section of numerical codes, and then you also have 2 sections of alphanumeric codes. First, you have the V codes that start with a V, and then the E codes that, you guessed it, start with an E. You'll likely use all 3 types of diagnosis codes over the course of your career, but you're not always going to use all 3 on every claim. V codes, I just want to mention quickly, actually apply when a person, for 3 particular instances, when a person who is not sick goes for a medical service, such as an organ donor, when a person with a known disease or injury that's either resolved or unresolved goes in for a service or procedure for that disease or injury. That's, for example, like chemotherapy. And then the third instance for V codes is when a problem influences health status, but is not really a current condition. That's not the actual reason that the person is there to see the physician. And then E codes very briefly provide additional information to circumstances surrounding injuries, poisonings, and other conditions. For example, if your physician sees a patient who has a fracture, you may use an E code to describe that maybe that patient fell from a ladder. You would use an E code to explain that clinical circumstance and the actual situation surrounding the injury. One thing about E codes that you want to know is that you never use those as a primary diagnosis. V codes and the other ICD-9 codes, the numerical ones, can be usually, unless there's a note, used as primary diagnoses, but you can never use an E code as a primary. You'll see on slide 14 that I have my third golden rule here: never guess at a diagnosis code. You don't want to assign a wrong diagnosis to a patient because it looks like maybe the doctor thinks that that's what the patient has. That really can have long-term negative effects on the patient. For example, you wouldn't want to assign an HIV positive diagnosis to a patient who does not actually have HIV and who has not been confirmed as being HIV positive. Even if they're sent for a test because the doctor suspects maybe they're HIV positive, you don't want to put that in there until your doctor has a clear diagnosis that says that the patient is HIV positive. When you don't have a clear diagnosis in the documentation, what you need to do is you either need to go back to your physician, you need to wait for test results that may come back and give you a definitive diagnosis, or you can also code the signs and symptoms that prompted the patient to come in and see your practitioner in the absence of a definitive diagnosis. On slide 15, here's the last step in the READ process. It's D, determine the exceptions. Now, there are always going to be payer regulations and other exceptions that may prevent you from reporting the CPT and HCPCS and ICD-9 codes that you've come up with when you've gone through the first 3 steps of this READ process. After you've gone through those first 3 steps of reviewing the documentation, choosing your procedure codes, and choosing your diagnosis codes to identify the reason for the procedure, you need to check all the rules that are out there. There are going to be exceptions, like the ones listed in the bullet points on slide 15, that you may need to add additional information, such as the modifiers we talked about, or you may actually need to leave one or more codes off of your claim. So if you take a look at this list on slide 15, you'll see some of the things that you'll need to check. Coding rules and regulations, specific payer policies, AMA guidelines, code bundling rules, such as the Correct Coding Initiative, the CCI edits, modifier necessity, and then there are other ones out there. You may have specific things with your payers, but you may also have specific state laws or regulations that might govern some of what you can report for particular procedures or services. So that's really about all the time we have today. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of coding information out there. There's a lot to know, and it's kind of hard to cover more than just the very basics in a half hour. But hopefully you were able to gain some great knowledge and a solid foundation, and I hope you can apply that read process to really get off on the right foot when you're starting to code. If you follow the read process in those 4 steps, you'll really have a good basis for how to begin every claim that you sit down to work on. So if you need additional basic coding training, especially coding education specific to a particular medical specialty, you should check out audioeducator.com. Coming up this summer, Audio Educator will have several Coding 101 sessions, and you can also order CDs of just finished coding basic seminars as well. You can even get training in a specialty-specific area, such as urology, anesthesia, and OBGYN, which you can see on slide 16, some upcoming conferences that they're going to have, and also some just finished conferences you can get on CD. If you order within the next 30 days, I have a really incredible offer for you just for attending this webinar. Sign up online at audioeducator.com and you'll save an amazing $50. All you have to do to get the discount is enter the coupon code that's shown on this slide, slide 16. Don't miss this opportunity to continue your coding education at a very significantly reduced cost. Thank you all for joining me today for this webinar brought to you by supercoder.com. Check out the powerful online suite of coding products that supercoder.com offers. It's an easy and inexpensive way to stay up to date. Like I mentioned earlier, you really want to stay up to date on all the coding changes, and sometimes that's hard with the busy jobs that we all have. So you can use this resource like supercoder.com. On slide 18, you'll see I have my contact information there. If you have any questions about the information I've presented today or any other coding-related questions, please feel free to contact me. Both my email and my phone number are listed on this slide. So in conclusion, I just want to make sure that you remember that you want to have a good, solid foundation in coding to not only help the practices you work for, but really to advance your own career. It's not just important for the job that you do, but it's important for the jobs you may do in the future. Thank you again for attending today's webinar sponsored by supercoder.com, expert help for coders at any level in any specialty.